So hi everyone, my name is Akuna Uka. I am the outreach director for the National Parliamentary Debate League, along with my co-outreach director and partner in crime, Makendra McCoy. Also here from our board is Breyer, our NPDL president. So I very much thank them for being here tonight and in all of their support. So for those of you who are joining us for maybe the first, maybe the second, maybe the third time, I'll talk a little bit about what this is, why we're here, and then we'll get to hear from the person we're all here for, and that's Miss Lindsey Song. So first, the initiative that the NPDL board members started is called Outside the Round. And the goal of it is to gather all of you wonderful people to learn from an expert who's committed to advocacy, who's committed to fighting on the behalf of the marginalized, who in this case has a debate background herself, and so that's very exciting. But the goal is to learn from someone who is an expert in their field without the layer of competition that we have at our tournaments. Oftentimes when we're encountering other debaters, the only times we're hanging out with each other is when we're coming together to compete and to debate each other to win, and not necessarily to engage in a discussion to understand. And so that's the goal behind Outside the Round. I'm so excited you all are here. I'm going to read a little bit of Miss Lindsey Song's bio, and then we'll get started. So Lindsey M. Song Esquire is a senior staff attorney with the Courtroom Advocates Project at Sanctuary for Families. Lindsey represents indigent victims of domestic violence in family and Supreme Courts throughout New York City. She currently lives in Queens. Whoop, whoop. I'm from the Bronx, but that's okay. Lindsey is the co-chair of the New York Cyber Sexual Abuse Task Force, a collaboration of agencies, attorneys, and advocates working to end cyber sexual abuse laws, commonly known as revenge porn. Song and her agency were integral in drafting and passing anti-cyber sexual abuse laws in New York City back in 2018 and in New York State more recently in 2019. Lindsey received a BA from Duke University in 2011. She received her JD from George University Law Center in 2014. She is a 2010 Truman Scholar, and probably everyone on this call should know what a Truman Scholar is, because that could be soon in your future. So the Truman Scholarship is awarded to juniors in college who have demonstrated a consistent commitment to public service and have the intention of having a career in public service. And so we are very lucky to hear from Ms. Song. And once you hear about her work, it'll be very clear why she was named a Truman Scholar. Prior to joining Sanctuary in 2015, Song worked as the judicial law clerk to Judge Heidi Pasachow in the DC Superior Court. And she is a former public forum debater. And there are a lot of Parley people in the room, but there might be a couple of PF people who came out tonight to hear from you as well. So thank you so much, Lindsey, for joining us.
Yeah, so happy to be here. Thanks for the invite.
And so we'll get started with our first question. Could you go back to high school, go back to the period where many of our audience are currently in? Could you tell us a little bit about your experience in public forum and how that experience influenced you as an adult and perhaps influenced your career choices?
Absolutely. So I will say, first of all, that I feel like my high school self is dying a little bit right now, because I was a hardcore debater, and the idea that I would now be speaking to high school debaters is just like super thrilling. So I'm really grateful to be talking to all of you guys. You have wonderful, bright futures ahead of you. And I think debate is, just like a fantastic thing that helped me all through my college career, through my law school career. And now I'm a litigator. I'm in court like all the time. I do a ton of trials, objections, the whole courtroom scenario. And I feel like a lot of the skills that I built up in debate, like research skills and, how to I mean, how to argue, how to do it like respectfully, but also forcefully, and kind of just gaining my voice. It serves me really well in my job now, especially in New York City, where everyone is real mean all the time.
Sorry
So,
about that.
I'm like growing on me. I'm just like, I'm from South Carolina originally, and so like I think I mentioned before we got started, and so it was definitely an adjustment in the court system. But I was a public forum debater. I will say Parley was not really. We didn't have any at my high school. I went to a public high school in Greenville, South Carolina. It was really small in my state. I think we had like a very small number of Parley debaters that were maybe from like the Low Country. Public Forum and Lincoln Douglas and Extemp were like much bigger, and Public Forum actually in the time that I did it used like before, like right at the beginning, used to be called Ted Turner, which is like a real throwback to anybody who's like deep cuts. It's like, I'm sure that no one even knows that now, but I loved it. I mean, I thought it was fantastic. I went to nationals one year. We did, pretty well at states every year. I never was like on the national circuit constantly, but we did go one year, and that was very, very thrilling. But I think the research skills that you gain, especially from public forum, and I know Parley too, you have a longer topic, but public forum, you have to really stay on your toes because the new topic comes out every month, which is like kind of insane in retrospect. But just being able to get up to speed on a topic, learning all about it, being able to cite your sources is like like a huge thing as a lawyer, right? Very different. You're not looking at, research, or you're not looking at news articles and polls, et cetera, but you're looking at case law. But I think the whole basis is the same, and being really strict about that, that's something that I take really seriously, and something that many lawyers I have found do not take seriously. Like they'll submit briefs that are just their own opinion, which is like fine, but if you don't have any case law, you don't have any support behind your case, then you're probably not going to do very well. So I think that's a super important skill that debate taught me. I think also just the power of preparation, which I know is also huge in Parley as well. I mean, huge, right? So, being able to know a subject in and out, having all of your resources available, kind of at the drop of the hat, being super organized. I remember in high school, I would write up my little speeches, and I would like highlight every other line and, memorize my intros and everything. And those things have really served me well as an attorney. And finally, I mean, I think the biggest one, really being able to think on your feet, right? Getting those skills to be able to jump in, to dive in, to take a little bit of information, to quickly be able to summarize it, make it clear, to present it to a judge. I mean, to literally, obviously, different kinds of judges, right? Real life judges that are making really important decisions for your clients, whether it's in, a divorce or I primarily do orders of protection, restraining orders, or child support or criminal cases. I do some advocacy in those as well. So, pretty life-altering issues, right? And being able to take information in response to arguments that are coming up on the fly from opposing counsel. Oftentimes you're getting brand new information thrown at you, facts that are not good, that you're trying to suss out, you're trying to, disprove. And I think debate provides, just such an amazing basis for all of those skills. And, I love debate. I thought I was like one of my favorite thing that I did in high school. I'm still really great friends with all the people that I did high school debate with, from other states as well, from like different like national tournaments, and from, just meeting people all across. And hilariously, I've also like run into people from debate. When I went to Georgetown, and I was in the basement of like the student union, and I ran into a debate competitor that I had met at nationals in like 2006, and she was a 1L at Georgetown that year, and I've like watched her career afterwards. So people, it's just really nice to have that community and really learn from each other. So kudos to everybody here, and really looking forward to chatting with you more.
Thank you. And could you tell us what your current position is and what the role of your office is?
Sure. So I'm a senior staff attorney at Sanctuary for Families, which I realize I should put more in my bio about like what it is. We are the largest provider of legal services to survivors of gender-based violence in New York. New York State. So we operate out of New York City, but we are a really big agency. We have a ton of lawyers. A lot of agencies, have social workers and shelter staff and clinicians and all that, which we do. But we have a team of, I think our legal center is almost 100. Actually, I think maybe we're like 70 attorneys. And then we have 50 or 60 support staff, folks that are project assistants, like AKA like paralegals in the nonprofit world. So we do a lot. We have family law support. We do orders of protection, child support, custody, divorces, which are in separate courts in New York, which doesn't make any sense. You'd think that everything would be in family court because it's family, but it's not. We do immigration cases. We have, criminal advocacy. We do neglect representation. We housing, public assistance benefits, denial of benefits. So we have an Orthodox matrimonial project that works specifically within the Orthodox Jewish community and helping folks get divorces, both the religious divorce and a civil divorce, because oftentimes, even if you're getting the civil divorce, the Beit Din, which is the Jewish court, will not allow the survivor to get out of the religious part of the divorce. So we have Orthodox attorneys who speak Hebrew and are able to kind of navigate those systems. So all that is to say, we also represent survivors of campus gender violence and do advocacy in Title IX hearings. So we do a lot, a lot of legal services. And my role is I work primarily with students, actually. So again, love talking with students, really happy to do that. I work with law students primarily, and we train them to help people get orders of protection in New York City family courts. So in non-pandemic times, I go into the courthouse, just like walk in, and I talk to everybody there. And I ask them, are you filing for an order of protection today? Are you filing against an intimate partner? Can I help you in any way? Like, I ask them questions about what they're filing for. And if it seems like a good fit to work with a student and they want to work with a student, then the student will help them write up their petition, which is a legal complaint, to file with the judge. The student will draft it up, we'll interview them, we'll file it. And then later that day, the student will actually appear with the petitioner in front of the judge and advocate for the petitioner. So really exciting that people get that. I mean, in DC, we did not have that kind of experience. I think it's fantastic. And obviously in virtual times, it's quite different, which we'll talk about later, but that is normally my role. And so I think I've worked with like over 500 students, typically like over 100 a year. We train tons of people. We help tons of petitioners get assistance that normally, otherwise the court system is super scary, overwhelming, confusing, doesn't really make any sense. Nobody's there to walk you through the process. People get their cases dismissed because they don't write them well. They don't put the legal language that like they need to put in there. They just don't know how to, explain themselves. And so we help them with that. And that's primarily my role. I also have a ton of cases that I take on from that job, from that position where we get people in family courts. I also get referrals from the family justice centers in New York, which are one-stop shops for survivors of gender-based violence and trafficking. So people can walk in, they can get legal information, they can get referrals to counseling, they can talk to police if they want to do that, or the district attorney's office, and we'll get referrals from them. And then I also, as Akuna mentioned, I run a task force on the issue of cybersexual abuse or revenge porn. So we do a lot around electronic abuse, cyber abuse, stalkerware, spying, doxing, spoofing, all that. We can definitely get into that if you guys would like to, because I feel like I actually learn a lot from talking with younger people, telling me what all the like TikTok I know is like the newest thing. So, and if there is a technological, if there's an app, if there's, a website, if there's social media, you better bet that there are people harassing each other on it. And often ways in which domestic violence survivors and others, really, harassment, cyberbullying, are happening on those platforms. So we do a lot around that work and around, of course, the unlawful, essentially sending of intimate images, like I mentioned, AKA revenge porn or cybersexual abuse.
Thanks, Lindsey. And so your office covers divorces and issues of abuse and issues of cyber abuse, but you mentioned that it's based on issues of gender-based violence. Could you explain what that means exactly?
Sure. So we serve all survivors of gender-based violence, and we strive to create a world where freedom from gender-based violence is a human right. So what that means is a lot of our clients are women, not all of them. Gender-based violence can look like a lot of things, right? It can be discriminating against someone because of the way that they present, discriminating against someone based on their sexual orientation or their identity. We have a huge number of LGBTQ clients, and actually a sad fact that I learned in doing this, revenge porn, cybersexual abuse work is that those who are LGBTQ are actually 4 times more likely to be survivors of that particular abuse than those who are heterosexual. We have a lot of male clients as well, but what we work on specifically is a lot of domestic violence, what you'd think of as domestic violence, right? Where one partner is engaging in power and control over the other partner. That's really what we look at. It's not really about whether or not like people are happy, or even if there's physical violence. Like often when there's physical violence, that is what we determine as a domestic violence or intimate partner violence. But sometimes there can be mutual violence. Mostly we look at where one partner is engaging in that pattern of power and control over that other partner. So it could be, again, like depending on, it could be, heterosexual couples, it could be LGBTQ couples, it could be anybody. So we work on those cases. We also do a lot of anti-trafficking advocacy, anti-trafficking work. We represent survivors of sex trafficking, labor trafficking. We do female genital mutilation, FGM work. We were also very active in several legislative pushes in New York State around that issue, and some limited federal work on a lot of these issues as well, but mostly New York State. And things like vacation cutting, which was where children are often sent back. It's often done out of the country because it's not a legal procedure in many places in the US. But if they're from another country where it is legal, that, on holidays, people are forced into FGM without their consent. We had a big push against child marriage in New York until 5 years ago. It was legal for someone who was 14 to get married with parental consent. And I think, 14 and then 15, I think, without parental consent. Now the age has been raised. But we do a lot of different areas of advocacy in kind of gender-based violence as a whole. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but really anytime that of violence or abuse is happening against someone because of their gender, of their expressed gender, of their gender identity, of their sexual orientation, all of that is what we would term gender-based violence.
No, that certainly does answer my question. Thank you. And how would you define cyber abuse? And then what is the intersection in your experience between gender-based violence and cyber abuse?
Yeah, so cyber abuse is, I think it's a pretty broad term, but it covers a lot. I think a lot of what we see is, really any kind of utilizing of technology or, social media, web-based applications. There's so many ways in which the internet and technology can be misused, right? And we actually recently, one of my colleagues had said, we should kind of shift away from saying like technology abuse to, technology facilitated abuse or technology enabled abuse, because technology in itself is fantastic, right? Like there's so many good uses of technology. There's ways in which it can bring people together, in which it can protect people. There's all kinds of apps out there that I'm happy to talk about, like really creative ways that people protect survivors of gender-based violence, women, really just everybody, safety apps, apps that help people keep law enforcement and police accountable. There's a lot of ways in which it can be a really fantastic, thing. But also on the other side of that is ways in which it can be utilized against folks. So, just a couple. I'm also happy to, I know I had sent you some articles, but I'm happy to send them out or like put them in the chat if we want. There's also a couple other ones then. Yeah, there's also a couple other ones that are great. There was one in the New York Times that some of our colleagues that I wasn't quoted, but some of my colleagues were about the Internet of Things. So, thinking broadly, any ways in which you're connected to technology that can be misused, right? So we have actually this amazing connection with this organization called Operation Safe Escape, and it's a group of former security like operations professionals who were like mostly like military and like computer guys, and they have now created a nonprofit to help typically survivors of domestic violence kind of escape their abusers, like disappear online. So I've had several clients who have been stalked across state lines by their abusers, who have been, I mean, I had a client who fled across 4 different states. I mean, she was like in a domestic violence shelter and her bed caught on fire. You know, she came to New York and he popped up on the street and was following her saying he was going to kill her. He tried to run her over a car in Texas and was incarcerated there for that. But he kept finding out where she was and she couldn't figure out how it was. And we don't really exactly know because she came to us after he kind of was picked up on the Texas charges. But she thinks it was probably her cell phone. And we hear these things all the time that people have ways in which they're connected, right? We had a client who logged into her Netflix account and she logged in and she saw that the profiles had been changed to say her name, I am watching you. And so she logs in, and this is a person too that like she had tried to hide for her, like run away from this person and be never found again, which was absolutely beyond terrifying for her. Right. There's a lot of ways in which these things pop out. People have, well, actually, I'll just tell a brief story about what Chris from Operation Safe Escape would say, that, you know, he said, I met a woman and she said, you know, my dogs are turned against me. My dishwasher is singing to me and like, nobody will listen to me. And she goes to the police and the police are like, okay, like lady, like what, you're crazy. Like what's happening. Right. And Chris is the head of the organization. He starts talking to her and figuring out that she has I think it was an LG, like a dishwasher, one of the, you know, the kind of Bluetooth and technology enabled ones. And the abuser had essentially hacked into the LG dishwasher and would have it play like, it would, I mean, basically you could like play different songs and have it play. I think he had to play like Happy Birthday, like on her birthday. And her, you know, it's not like her dogs were actually like hating her, obviously, but during the day when she was away, he had hacked into her Nest. There was like, you know, like a thermometer in the home, and he was turning up the temperature really high during the day. So when she came home, the dogs were super upset because they had been in like 100-degree heat all day. So these were real forms of abuse. And I hope that folks on the call are familiar with the term gaslighting, but if not, I will say it really quickly, which we see all the time in our cases, which is essentially really convincing somebody that their form of reality is not their own, right? Like telling somebody what you're experiencing is not real, making them feel like they're crazy. And that happens all the time in domestic violence cases, all the time in the cases that we work on, and making someone feel like their story. So like, you know, oh yeah, I feel like I'm going insane. Like my dishwasher is doing all this crazy stuff. My dogs are going nuts. And it takes a lot for people to get through to help that way, because people do think like this person is nuts or they're not credible. And don't even get me started on law enforcement or the court system hearing stories like that. It's incredibly difficult for people to be held accountable and really make it feel like people are, know what is actually happening. So those are just a couple examples. I help clients with a lot of tech abuse that's a little bit less sophisticated often. It can be as unsophisticated as like sending text messages and blowing up somebody's phone, and really just, you know, getting them fired from their job, or even just like harassing them at work so that it's difficult for them to do their job, right? It could be a lot of different forms. Getting into their family plans. Family plans are often shared. There's information that you can see, you know, where somebody is. Like there could be location sharing. People may not even be aware of that kind of information. I don't know if it's possible to do like not a poll necessarily, but if anybody could, I don't know if the chat is enabled, but I'd be curious to hear like who on the call, like if any of y'all have like Find My Friends enabled on your phone, or the Snap Map.
Ooh, that's a good one. So you're asking, and maybe now I'm giving away my age because I'm not even sure what you're talking about. Can you repeat that? And then folks, the chat is open. Repeat it slowly for the old people on the call, Lindsey. We're not all familiar with that. But please ask the question again. And then folks, the chat is open. I would love to see the kind of informal poll as well.
Yeah, so if anybody has Find My Friends, any app or, it's a function either on I know the iPhone, I don't have an Android. I know that there's similar functions on Android, but if you have Find My Friends enabled so that your friends can see where you are, where you're hanging out, or on Snapchat, the Snap Map, where if you go into Snapchat and I think they changed it to like, if you open it, if you pull it down, and it'll show you where your friends are located, like on Snapchat. I don't know if any, yeah, it looks like a couple of people have already said that they have those enabled on their phone. There might be other ones too. There might be other apps that I'm not familiar with. Those are the big ones. It looks like a couple of folks have had that on there. Yeah. So, I mean, this is a huge thing that people often don't think about, right? I mean, I had a client who had enabled, you know, location sharing on her phone. So there's also ways that not even, I mean, Find My Friends, whatever, there can be location sharing where you share with individual people, right? My sister had like asked me, she's a lot younger than me, and she had asked me a while ago, like, oh, for my location sharing, and I forgot about it. And it's not like the phone reminds you of that. I think that Apple's done a better job recently of kind of sending periodic reminders. But you know, I had a client who had forgotten that she had turned on share my location with her boyfriend like many years before, and then they broke up, and then it turned out he was still accessing that information after they broke up and was showing up places that she was, and she was really freaked out by it. She's like, how did he know I was going to be here? Yeah, it looks like a couple folks have some of those on there. I'm again not saying it's a bad thing inherently, right? Like it's kind of fun to be able to see where your friends are and meeting up with them. But there are, I think, just being thoughtful about the things that we're using, and kind of being aware of the ways in which they can be used against us. I wonder too, I don't know if we have time, but there's like a really creepy thing I like to show people on the phones if people have a minute. If you have an iPhone, I don't know how to do it on an Android, but if people have iPhones, this is one that if we have a second, I can do like a quick thing. So if everyone, this is like one where everyone should like actually get out their phones. If you have a phone, an iPhone specifically, and if you go into general, sorry, you know what, let's go into here. Find out where it is actually. Here we go, sorry, privacy, it's under privacy now. And then go to location services. Do you guys know where to find location services?
So slowing it down again for, yeah. So settings.
Yeah, I think it's under privacy.
Privacy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Location services.
Mm-hmm.
So it should show you location services at the top. It should say like location. I don't know if you can see this on my phone also. It's totally smashed. So I'm sorry about that. Location services. Most people will have this on in some way, like whether you have what information you have. So if you have location services on, you need to go all the way down to the bottom. So you'll see all the different apps on there that are sharing your location or looking at your location, right? You might have, you know, Google Maps, you might have, you know, that's just also an important thing, a helpful thing to look at, like which apps are using your location. Does everyone see where it says system services? It says system services at the very, very bottom. Yep, system services. Click on that. Okay, and do you see where it says significant locations? Anyone not see where it says significant locations? Okay, so click on that if you're able to find that. Mine is actually off because I've turned it off a long time ago, but if you have it on, what does it say? What does it show?
So I have never toggled to this in my life.
Yeah.
And this is why we come to Outside the Round, because we learn something new every time. I see the history of my locations, and you know, we are in the middle of a pandemic, so I haven't been to all that many places, but it's listing Culver City, Inglewood, Los Angeles, and it's wow. Okay.
So this is one too. For those of you that were back in location services, I don't know if you can see, it's kind of bright on my phone. You can see everything. Okay. So at the top you have the location services, and then go all the way to the bottom where it says system services, and then click on that. And then you're going to want to go down to significant locations. And if you have it on, it will show you essentially like places that you go all the time, right? Apple is storing that information. It's accessible on your phone. And I turn it off because I find it super creepy. I'm like, I don't want that to be saved on there. And it has apps and where you're located. So, and I think also people are commenting too, like all the different apps that they didn't realize were sharing their location. So, you know, just a very small example of, you know, information and ways in which we're sharing information without even realizing it, right? With our phones are like straight up super mini computers. They are navigation devices. They are GPSs, and we're carrying around them all the time. And one note people may be aware of or may not be that even if you turn your phone on airplane mode, it still has its GPS. So I went to China several years ago with my husband and his family, and I took a ton of pictures when we were there. I had my data off the entire time for many reasons, and on airplane mode. And when I came back to the US and I looked at the pictures, all of the photos had locations tagged where I was in China, like very specific places. And that's because your phone still has its GPS and its internal GPS, even when it's on airplane mode. So that is not gonna save you from information being, now it depends on what you're sharing it with, obviously, if you're Bluetooth, etc. But people should just know that like that doesn't remove like, you know, people being able to access that information potentially. So all that is like a super long-winded way of saying that there's just a lot of ways in which technology can be, you know, perverted, unfortunately used against people. And I've seen a lot of different ways in which that happens. And a lot of what we do too, I've had to kind of become a little bit of a, I wouldn't say expert by any means, but just knowledgeable about the ways in which technology works and the ways in which people are using it. It could be something even from, if I have a client who's doing a video visitation with an abuser, making sure that there's nothing in the background of their Skype that's going to indicate where they are, making sure that the child, if that's on the video visit, is not going to accidentally disclose information, you know, even having a certain sound on, or having, you know, a street sign in the background, especially in our confidential shelters. That's hugely important to make sure that that information remains safe and confidential. Where I'm from, like I said, South Carolina, there was actually a woman who her husband found out where she was living in a shelter, and he drove up right outside, and she walked out of the shelter, and he killed her. He shot her. So that is, I mean, just a paramount importance that people are aware of the ways in which technology can, you know, not just be helpful, but can also be harmful or can be used in ways to hurt them and their families.
And Lindsay, just to add something, and you were mentioning about Android, if you go into Android and you actually look at Google location history, or if you use Google services or Google Map, you can see nearly a complete map of where you've been for the last year. And when many people track this, they don't realize you literally can follow everybody second by second your entire life. And if you go to Google, you can download this, and people are utterly shocked. A few years ago, there was somebody who hacked somebody's Google account, pulled their personal info, and was able to stalk them, I believe over the course of like 3 years, without them ever realizing it, because they had their path so known, they could figure out where they were at what time of day, where they were on the street. It's disturbing. It'll know things about you you didn't realize. So I've seen that as well.
That is such a good point. Thank you for raising that. That's another one that I didn't realize until not that long ago either, that Google is, if you have location, I think it's location history, it'll have a timeline essentially of where you were and what day. And a creepy thing in New York, when I'm on the train, if I get on the train and I go a stop or two on the train, my phone will pop up with a notification and be like, oh, like tell others how crowded your trip on the 7 was today. Because it knows, like, it looks like where you were, how fast you were moving in relation to other people. And so, you know, whatever. Again, there could be ways in which that's cool and informative and useful, but I turned it off again because I was like, I don't feel like the world is going to be benefited from anybody having the information about where I was minute to minute of every day. And that's particularly important too, again, for like survivors, or for people who are just, you know, want to be savvy about their data. So super good point. Thank you for sharing that.
So many good points. Thank you, Briar. I'm also wondering, Lindsay, could you talk a little bit more about those laws in New York City and in New York State that you helped to establish, maybe starting with what was the problem, and then why were you advocating for these laws? And then now what do those laws, hopefully, what will they protect people from?
Sure. So one form of, you know, cyber abuse or technology facilitated abuse is what is commonly termed as revenge porn. I'm sure you've heard the term. It's also called non-consensual pornography. We use the term cybersexual abuse. I don't really think it's porn. I mean, it seems like kind of a misnomer to me. So we use cybersexual abuse to describe it. Basically people taking photos of other people without their consent and then distributing them or threatening to distribute them. But it doesn't have to be that, right? It could just be that people are sending photos in their relationship as a part of a romantic relationship, right? They're sending pictures to each other, sexting, like people, it happens all the time, as much as people don't want to pretend that it's not. And I think I'm preaching to the choir with you guys, like in terms of your age, like we all know this is happening. And, you know, like it just is. People are sending these pictures. One caveat that I will always say when I'm talking to anyone under the age of 18 is that just be aware that if you are taking naked pictures of yourself or topless pictures and sending them, you are creating and distributing child pornography legally. Now there's a lot of, it's rare that I think that you would, I mean, I really haven't heard, I think I've heard of maybe a few cases where people have actually been prosecuted for that, but it often leads to people being afraid of reporting it if they have in fact taken a picture of themselves and then sent it to somebody, because yes, legally you have now created and sent child pornography. So we can talk later. I think that might be something we're going to talk about a little bit later too, ways to safely sext and do it in ways that is not going to be as dangerous for you legally. It's not to say that if this happens to you or someone that you know. Another term that people use often is exposed. I'm not sure if that's still a term that people are using, but like someone got exposed online. I don't know if y'all know any other, if you've heard of this kind of behavior, like what you call it, but I've heard people, especially that are like in high school, calling it somebody got exposed online. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether or not you sent the picture and took it to them and sent it to somebody with your consent. That doesn't mean that they then have the right to post it online or anywhere, right? They can't send it to their friends. They can't send it to your teachers. They can't post it on like 4chan or Tumblr or whatever it is. It doesn't matter whether or not you sent it to them consensually first or not. If you didn't consent to posting it online, then that was done without your consent. Really important, right? And that's, I think, seems like a difficult point sometimes for judges and law enforcement to understand, but think about it like this. Like, if I went to the doctor and I got like a very, if I got information about a test, right? Or if I went to the bank and I have my bank account numbers, if my bank suddenly went online and posted my bank account login information, or my doctor went online and posted all about my test results, like that would be really bad, right? Everyone would be super mad and say that's absolutely a violation of privacy. And how can you do that? And it was, of course, everyone understood that like those test results were to be shared between me and my doctor, or the bank records were to be shared with me and my bank without my permission to send it elsewhere. I don't know why people have such a hard time understanding it when it comes to like a photo, where I'm sending you a photo, I'm understanding it's going to be shared between you and me. So that's the problem. I don't want to say that was the problem. It continues to be the problem. It's a huge number of people that are affected by this. I think it's I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. I should have pulled this up, but like 40% of women have had this happen to them at some point in their lives, either had a photo sent to them, or, oh, yep, there was an example of, I see in the chat, of a child pornography charge against an individual, like a child who sent it of themselves. So yeah, it does happen. It's quite rare, thank God, but it is something to be aware of. But essentially these things were happening all the time, right? In the context of domestic violence, somebody taking a photo, maybe that they took, again, while things were good in the relationship. I have lots of clients who have been with their abusers for many years. They have children with them. They have families with them. They love them, they care for them, and they sent photos to them at some point. And I had a client who her abuser said, if you ever go to court and try to get custody, I'm going to take these pictures and I'm going to show them to the judge. And guess exactly what he did when she filed for order of protection and custody. We come into court and his attorney has printed out all these naked photos of her and is literally waving them around the courtroom, saying, well, look at her, like she's out here like posting all these photos, and like basically like what a slut she is. And I mean, it was awful. And luckily in that case, the judge shut that down real quick. And we had an order put in place that he was not to disseminate any photos of her, anything like that. So, and that's something that you can get now, that was not necessarily super popular before, but this was the issue. It continues to be the issue. We were able to lobby for a city bill that made it illegal for people to distribute pictures, intimate pictures. There's very, very specific definitions that I won't go into, but suffice to say it's mostly naked photos, topless photos, genitalia. If you're sending pictures of that without somebody's consent online or really to any other person, then that is a misdemeanor. And if you threaten to do that, that's also a misdemeanor in New York City. We, as I understand it, as I have not found any other city that has this law on the books, or we were the first one to do it. Several counties did it after us, some counties in New York, and I think a handful of other small cities have done it. We also, after that, were able to lobby for a state law that did the same thing on the state level, because it, obviously it's not just New York City where this is happening, and New York State is a huge place, and it was happening in all over the state. So in 2019, we were able to get that passed. And so now it is also a crime in New York State for you to do that similar behavior. It's not a crime to threaten to distribute photos in New York State, which was a bummer. And we can talk about that in like First Amendment stuff if you guys have questions. I feel pretty strongly that that is not an expression of free speech. Free speech is limited in many ways, as we learn in the law. You can't just say whatever you want, right? Like hate speech. But those are a very small difference in the state and city law. But my task force that I run on Sanctuary for Families, and many of our survivor leaders, including one of my former clients, her name is Nathalie. She's been very open about her story, Nathalie Rodriguez, and I'm happy to send an article about what she spoke out about. But she was actually very active too in passing the law and speaking to legislators. I think that was huge to actually hear from somebody who had experienced this firsthand. She had dated someone, and 10 years later, after they had dated, she was running for Miss New York, and he found out, and he said, "I'm going to make sure that you never live a normal life again." And he sent her a video that he had posted on a porn site of them having sex, that she had never agreed to have it taken. She didn't even know it was taken. So it was taken. That's a whole other level, right? When you take a video of someone or take pictures of them without their consent, that's an additional crime, actually. And he put it online without her consent. And he also shared her father's name and phone number with that video. And she was able to get it taken down. We were able to get criminal, prosecution and an order of protection for her. But she felt suicidal afterwards. She didn't know what she was going to do. And that's actually a really common response of people that were polled who have been survivors of this kind of abuse, that I think 87% of them had considered suicide at some point. And actually we've had clients that have attempted suicide, and others that I think have been successful. There's some international cases where unfortunately that did happen. So it's a really serious, a really life-ruining form of abuse that I think people don't really take that seriously sometimes, unfortunately. But I hope that answers your question about kind of the legislative history and background and where we got to where we are.
It absolutely does. And the story that you told of the man who brought the photos into court, what you said that, really disturbed me is that it was his attorney who was then sharing them with the judge. And so that lack of judgment from, the person representing him is, I don't know if I would go as far as shocking, but definitely very deeply disturbing. So there's obviously something going on where this is not seen as unacceptable by certain people. Could you talk a little bit more about what it took to get those laws passed, and what were the arguments maybe against those laws, or why would there not be support? Like that law that you mentioned that was enacted in New York City, but is not currently the case in New York State. Why is that the case?
Yeah, super good question. And I will also say I had another attorney only like several months ago who was a woman who said, essentially, if you don't settle this case with our client, then my client took a video or took a FaceTime. He recorded a FaceTime where my client took off her shirt and she was topless. And the attorney actually told me, like, if you don't settle the case, I'm going to release this in court. And I said, that's literally illegal. And I'm going to report this to the police. And then she backed off. But it was shocking to me that she put this in writing in an email. The fact is, it's so normalized, I think, the idea, the victim blaming mentality that like, well, you shouldn't have been naked, you shouldn't have taken a picture, and that makes it all okay. Somehow, I think it's incredibly problematic and really runs very deep in our society, not just, in the court system. And again, coming from South Carolina, I really thought that coming to New York, it would be this like amazing, like progressive, liberal, and it is in some ways, but also it's also really bad in a lot of ways, right? There's still racism, there's still sexism, there's still a ton of victim blaming mentality of, well, why'd you stay with that person? Or why didn't you leave that relationship? And so I think that was a huge barrier, was overcoming that, especially within the court system and also the legislatures, right? So from the city point, we worked really hard. The city council is smaller, right? From a city standpoint, it's a little bit easier in that there's like a smaller number of people you have to convince, right, to make a law. There was already some interest in that law. So what we really did for that was we worked very, very hard on the language to make sure that the language was not going to be too broad or too restrictive. There's several issues with the New York City law that are not great, that I find problematic. that there's one exception for if essentially something happened in a public place. And that was specifically to address things like the denudas in Times Square. So the women who are topless and they put paint and they dress up and they put paint on like all of their parts to make sure that they're not like visible. And so the idea was if you take a picture of somebody who's topless willingly in a public space, that would not be, you know, and then you post it online, that you're not then committing a crime. Great thought, right? Makes sense. But the way that the language is worded, it doesn't have any exception for if somebody is, for example, sexually assaulted in a public place, or if somebody rips off their shirt in a public place and then takes a picture. And we actually had a client who, I won't share too many details because her video actually went viral internationally. She had to change her name and move out of state, but essentially she was like forced to parade around outside without any clothes on by her abuser. And that video was posted online. And, you know, I have concerns about whether or not even in the law was not in place at that time. And even if it had been, I don't know, like, would that have been a good argument for the attorney? Probably, that it was in a public place. So there are still problems with the laws as they were, but the New York City law, we worked a lot on as best we could, getting the language that we wanted, you know, limiting some of it. There was different arguments about intent standards. And for any of those of y'all that want to go to law school, you'll learn all about what is a standard of intent. You know, do I need to specifically intend that an action happens? So a difference would be, you know, if I take my fist and I like punch you in the face, like you're right there, and I take my fist and I look at you and I punch you in the face. You know, arguably I'm intending to punch you, I'm intending to cause you physical harm, right? If I close my eyes and I have both my fists and I know that you're there, but I don't know exactly how far or whatever, and I close my eyes and I go, and I kind of wildly flail around, right? Maybe I'm not intending specifically to hit you in the face, but I'm probably being reckless, right? Because I know that you're there. I am willfully disregarding the substantial risk that I'm going to hit you. So we were arguing about different levels of intent. We, in the domestic violence community, wanted lower levels of intent because intent is often hard to prove, right? How do you prove that somebody specifically wanted to hurt you by posting your picture online? Did they say it? Did they put a little caption? Did they tag you and say this person's a whore? Then yeah, probably easier to prove intent. But oftentimes people are not that dumb and they don't always leave a breadcrumb trail. So some of those issues we argued about and tried to push. And I think on the state level, a big argument is, and often a fair argument, in many cases, is that there is, you know, not a push to further criminalize behavior, right? And I think especially in the time of BLM, just being very aware of the criminal justice system, I find really compelling in a lot of ways, but I also feel like there are certain crimes that should be crimes. And we had the same resistance to making strangulation a crime, believe it or not, many years ago. And the argument is, well, this is already covered under other crimes. Which kind of, yes. I mean, I guess you could say strangulation is assault, or I guess you could say cybersexual abuse is harassment. But what we know in practice is that nobody was getting in trouble for it at all. Nobody was being arrested for harassment. People were being turned away from precincts and from court saying, well, that's not illegal, we can't help you. You know, that's really just like a family thing, or, you know, why did you take those pictures to begin with? And so crafting specific crimes to address specific behavior and specific gender-based violence behavior, that was really our big argument, was this is a particular kind of crime with particular life-ruining you know, aspects and life-ruining like ways that it really truly blows up people's lives. They have to change their name and move out of state. We've had several clients that have had to flee the state. One case that you may have heard of was actually a case with Grindr, where we had a client who his abuser was on Grindr. It's actually a sanctuary client. My very close colleague represented him in family court. I went to the abuser's sentencing, and he had gone into Grindr and essentially created all these terrible fake profiles at saying that the victim, the survivor, wanted people to come to his house to have sex with him. You know, I need you to come. Also saying like horrible, like xenophobic, racist, like awful things. So people would show up at the client's home. They showed up at his job, like hundreds. I mean, I think at the end it was actually thousands of men that came, and to the point where the client had to quit his job. He moved out of state and has started a whole new life in another state because of how much it affected him. And one of the people that came to the house actually assaulted his roommate because they were so angry that when they got there that they were not going to get what they came for, which was sex. They were really angry about that. So I think the biggest push was that people were saying this is already covered, or this isn't like basically bad enough to be a specific crime in itself. And I think talking about kind of the effect on the clients and having a survivor come and speak was really amazing to be able to push back on that and be very specific about the language. And also I will say 46 other states at the time that New York passed it, I think it was 41 other states had passed this. And now it's like 46 states in the District of Columbia. So there's only a handful of states that have not passed specific laws about this issue. So New York was just like really behind. And so we use that as well to kind of light a fire a little bit.
And now that most states have a law regarding this, do you find that folks are actually being prosecuted for it? Or is there a gap between what's on the books and what's actually happening?
Yeah, they are being prosecuted. I think it's often not the number one, it's not the leading charge, as we say, the lead charge. So people aren't being picked up on necessarily as the main charge. But what we know from domestic violence is it's often happening as a part of a pattern of behavior. So I have a client right now where the lead charge was criminal contempt and threats because he was threatening to kill her in violation of an order of protection. And then also he was the abuser actually sent me naked photos of my own client. He hacked into her phone, got my contact information, sent me pictures of her, sent it to everyone in her contact book, and was later prosecuted for, like, added on those charges. So I find that people aren't necessarily being arrested just for that, like it's being added on. Although we are seeing some prosecutions, but there's also been, acquittals and not lack of convictions for many reasons. I think victim blaming stuff, right? Like, again, why did you take the photo? If it's going to be a jury trial, you're going to leave it up to a jury, and maybe a jury is not going to find that person should have taken that photo, which is unfortunate, but it's also reality of juries and democracy. And there are also some exceptions, which I don't want to get too into the weeds because I think we're almost out of time, but that people have had very valid, like people have argued that it doesn't fit, it's kind of the intent provision is one of them. Another is in the city law, you have to get the picture directly from the person. So either I take a naked picture and I send it to somebody and then they post it, or that person takes a picture of me. If it's like a third party, like let's say I send it to my husband and then he sends it to his friend and then the friend posts it, the friend is not on the hook for the New York City law, which is problematic to say in the least. And the idea was you didn't want to punish actually a lot of like concerns about kids, teenagers, like forwarding on pictures and then distributing it. They didn't want to like have, person like X who got it from person Y and all the way back to be prosecuted for that. But that has resulted in some dismissals as well, or just, I think that makes it a little bit tougher. So just goes to show you that legislative drafting is super important. You want to make sure that the law, think about all the unintended consequences of the language that you're putting in. And we've learned firsthand we learned that from the city bill. We were like, we're not going to make sure that doesn't get to the state bill. And there's also some interesting provisions in the state bill about requiring Google, not specifically Google, but internet service providers to take down pictures online that are reasonably within their control, which was a huge battle. And actually tech companies really did not want to pass that law, which is interesting because there's a lot of tech saying we want to support survivors of revenge porn and cyber sexual abuse, but then behind closed doors, their lobbying organization, the Internet Association, actually fought very hard against this law and cost us a whole year. We were going to pass it in 2018 in the 11th hour. It was literally like 11:45 p.m. and they were about to vote on it. And last minute, we're pushed it off because of some lobbying at the end. So eventually we did get it passed and we did get that provision that holds internet service providers accountable. But there was also a lot of pushback from tech companies, sadly, behind closed doors.
Thanks, Lindsey. And that was actually a question that had come up, was the role of private companies in this technology assisted abuse. So I appreciate that you told that story. I know that we're getting very late. There's just one more question that was submitted that I do want to ask, and I'll read it just so that I make sure I get their wording. It says, the public is generally supportive of cracking down on cyber sexual abuse. At the same time, the public is hesitant to give the government power to survey internet use and ban anonymity on the internet. What are some policy proposals that can address the former without undermining the latter?
Yeah, I love that question. I feel like it's like a true like debater kind of question of like balancing of rights, and really valid, right? I mean, I think that there is always going to be a balance between individual, kind of accountability and also a right of free speech or a right of privacy. I do find though that it's actually very, very difficult to, for my work, I'll say, number one, the government really isn't controlling the speech in that if there's a crime on the books and says you can't do this, then yes, technically the government is controlling that speech, but it's not like the government's like going into people's computers and seeing if they have these photos, right? A lot of it is once it's become public in some way, once you distribute it to somebody or posted it online or sent it to someone. But in terms of anonymity, it's actually a huge problem. We have a really hard time. It's almost impossible sometimes to hunt down if somebody has created a fake account or sending it from multiple. Free text now is a big one. There's a lot of websites where you can text, for free and just create fake numbers. It's actually very hard to track that kind of stuff down. It makes it very difficult for people so if I go on there and I send a bunch of naked pictures, like using free text now, it would be a lot more difficult. You have to like subpoena the internet service provider, see what the IP address was, somehow link it back to me. I think anonymous speech is actually much more protected in many ways than other forms of speech, mainly just because there's so many ways of speaking anonymously, and it's really hard to get that information. So it's an interesting question about kind of the balance between them. I think generally the balance between free speech and somebody's rights and responsibilities, we see on the other side too. We've had many clients who want to speak out about being sexually assaulted or assaulted by classmates, and they want to talk about it online, but they are of course limited by slander laws and libel laws, which say that you can't post something false about somebody online. Obviously, from their point of perspective, it's not false, but guess what? There's going to be a whole litigation about whether or not it is false. And then you're going to have to prove that you were sexually assaulted in a court, and you're going to, it's going to cost you tens of thousands of dollars. It can be really dangerous in that way. So I think it goes both ways, where survivors and victims are also like kind of, gagged from speaking online, just as people would say, well, I have the right to, post this content of this person because they sent it to me. And, I think they look really hot and I want other people to see it, or, I think it's funny, or whatever it is. I want to teach them the lesson. There's a lot of different ways and reasons why we post what we do, and people do that. But I think about it like in law school, one of the first things you learn in like your, con law, not your second con law class. The first con law is all really boring, but the second con law is about individual rights and responsibilities. And, essentially, and even just the old adage of like, my right to extend my fist ends at another man's nose, right? I could do whatever I want as long as it's not impacting the rights and liberties of somebody else, because that person also has rights and liberties. And so you do have to balance in what ways am I being restricted, right? If I'm being restricted from posting a naked picture of you without your consent, like, is that really a restriction? Like, it's a pretty limited restriction in my opinion. Like, just post another picture, right? Or like post something else, post your own naked body online. That's fine, live your life. But to take somebody else's information and post it online, I find it problematic. But I do agree that there's a balance in what people can post. And oftentimes, so often clients come to me and say, well, he's posting really mean things about me online. He's saying really mean things about me to all my family and friends. He's going on my Yelp page and saying all kinds of horrible stuff. That's kind of the First Amendment in a lot of ways. Is this person threatening to kill you? Are they threatening to hurt you or you and your family? Are they saying things that are completely false? Are they, doing things that are otherwise prohibited by law? If not, that's probably valid speech. And I tell people that all the time. Like, just because it's mean or just because it's bad doesn't mean it's illegal. And I think it is a hard thing for people to come to terms with, but there is a line there between what is bad and mean and what is illegal. And I think for a long time, we've just put revenge porn or cybersexual abuse in the, well, it's bad, but it shouldn't be illegal. I think something like, catcalling or street harassment kind of falls into the bad, but shouldn't necessarily be illegal category, right? Like, that's not great. We should work on like social ways that we stop people from just like, objectifying women or people who are female identifying, or saying, sexually harassing people. But I don't think necessarily that should be illegal, just very personally. So I think it's a super good question. I think the answer is like, probably that kind of answer is going to be debated by many legal scholars. But I hope that was a kind of a helpful answer.
It was. And Lindsey, this has been so educational. I mean, not only just in learning more about my own phone and some of the choices that I make in terms of my apps and the information that I'm sharing, I'm also processing what information do we all as a community choose to share with each other, whether that's family members, people that we are intimate with, or our friends, and just being very conscious of the information that we're sharing. I got a private message saying, "Oh, is Miss Song coming back again to do a part 2? Maybe, after the baby is, a few months and you're back in business, we would love to have you." I realize I monopolize almost the entire time. If there's one question from a student that they're burning to get out, and then we will say goodnight. I realize I have a million questions, and I'm like, okay, we'll save that for the part 2. But if there's a student who has one question, I will let you just get that in. You can either unmute yourself or type in the chat.
I have a question. What inspired you to do your work right now?
Yeah, such a good question. I always wanted to go into public interest. Actually, back in high school and even through law school, actually, I did animal law and animal stuff, which is like a very different thing. I did like a bunch of working for animal causes for the Humane Society, and believe it or not, that was too depressing for me, because nobody really cares about animals. And by nobody, I mean like the laws do not really care about animals. There's very few laws that protect animals, and it's kind of a fighting, like just a very sad battle. And also it's very boring law. It's all what we call administrative law. It's very statutory. It's very based in like, can you find like a law and like kind of find a loophole or an exception, or like it's very finicky. And I found it really overwhelming and really sad. So instead, I moved into family law, and my little sister was actually adopted through the family court system. And so kind of having that personal experience, I learned a lot about the way family courts work. And I just became really interested in family law. And I did my domestic violence clinic when I was at Georgetown, and I represented several women in order of protection cases in DC Superior Court, and just kind of fell in love with it. And when I came to New York, I've been in my current position for 5 years now, and I have the benefit of not only working with clients and empowering them to make their own choices, but also working with students and teaching them. So I feel like it's kind of been like a pathway to get there, but I always knew I wanted to use, kind of my skills and what I wanted to do to make the world a better place. And I truly do hope, and that's where kind of the Truman comes into, to make the Truman plug again, which is also a Truman, I will say, like that's how we met. And it's a fantastic community. I have so many close friends who are Trumans and who are out here, like truly making the world a better place. We're in politics, we're in government. Like Chris Coons is, he's a senator. Yes, he is, right? He's a Truman. Former Janet Napolitano was a Truman. Like there's a lot of people who are in major politics as well who are Truman. So
Stacey Abrams.
Oh my God, how could I forget Stacey Abrams? She literally interviewed me, and I'm obsessed with her. I love her so much. Also that she wrote all those books when she was in law school, like under the pen name Selena Montgomery. Anyway, all that is to say, it was kind of a long pathway, but I knew I wanted to do public interest, and that's kind of how I came to where I am. And I encourage everybody to, even if you think you know what you're going to do, like still try new things. And I learned that about law too. You'll figure it out pretty quickly that you may not like an area of law that you think you would. I think we have one. I don't want to hold you guys. I know it's after 10, but do we have time for this other question or no?
Oh, sure. Well, it's after 10 for you. I'm on the West Coast, so I'm.
Oh yeah, duh. Oh yeah. I don't mind. It's fine.
Okay. Then thank you so much. Yeah, I just wanted to be respectful of your time on the East Coast.
I'm a lawyer and I stay up all night all the time, so it's really fine for me. I don't mind. I will be awake for another 2 hours at least. So.
Okay. Yes, I see Alyssa has a question. Yeah. I'm not sure if you already touched on this, but how do you cope with having to represent the quote unquote wrong side? So do you ever find that you have to take on a client whose, you know, maybe actions or behavior or something makes you uncomfortable, it seems the question is.
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. I will be honest. I could, I think there's a lot of different ways in law that you can, and also the world, right, that you can do good in what you're doing, and in law too. And this is part of the reason why I never was I couldn't ever see myself being a prosecutor or a defense attorney, because I felt like it would be too difficult to kind of run that moral line of where you'd be prosecuting people and feel like that was not the right thing to do, or be defending people who did really heinous things. And I believe in both sides of the system, right? People, even people who did horrible things, they deserve and need good representation, because it should be the state's job to prove the case against them. And regardless of whether or not they're guilty, like, who cares? They still need good defense work. And same thing with prosecutors, right? Like, there are a lot of prosecutors that are doing really good work. I think we have a very long way to correct the system and find a place where people are doing it well and doing it ethically and doing it, without bias. But all that is to say, my job, I feel very lucky that I get to choose my clients. So I meet clients and I decide whether I'm going to represent them. A lot of that comes to credibility, right? I meet them and I kind of suss out. And I have to say, after working with thousands of clients over the years, I developed kind of a pretty decent gut instinct about if I meet somebody and I ask them questions, I kind of see their responses, I hear their stories. I can kind of tell if I think that maybe they're the aggressor in the situation or the abuser, or whether or not they're being honest. I will say I had one client one time who lied to me about being a survivor. She had said to another one of my clients, and it got back to me, that she was not a victim, that she was really proud of the fact that she was like taking advantage of, like, oh, I got all this stuff, like I'm not even a victim. I think maybe in retrospect that she was kind of working through her own trauma and saying that. I'm not really sure that she really wasn't a victim, but that's what she said and repeatedly bragged about. And when I talked to her about it, she refused to admit it. And so ultimately the trust that we had in that relationship, I ultimately had to tell her, I can't represent you because we don't have, we need to have a mutual trust and we need to have an ongoing relationship where we can be honest with each other. That's really critical in my job as an attorney. I need you to be honest with me. So that was, and that's out of, I've represented hundreds of people at this point, probably, worked with hundreds of people, certainly. So that it's tough. It's tough when you have somebody that has not told you the truth or is making choices that are, I don't judge people about, like, I have tons of clients who end up reconciling with their abusers or making choices that I would not make. It's part of my job as an attorney to really not be bothered by that. I will tell them it is my legal advice, so-and-so, and if they do something different, that's totally them. My job is to empower them and to lead whatever they want to do. But when people make decisions that are dangerous to themselves or dangerous to their children or their families, or are doing things that they're lying about, like, I do find that really problematic. And that's where you do have ethical obligations and ethical issues where you can withdraw from representing that person if you feel like the relationship is broken down, that you're not able to effectively advocate for them because they're not telling you the truth, or because they are making choices that are so contrary to your advice that you no longer can keep up that relationship with them. Like, if I tell them it is a really bad idea for you to go, and like, I had a client who reported to the police that she had to order protection and she didn't, she was lying. And I said, that's, and then several things happened like that. And that was a client ultimately that she fired me, and I was very grateful for, because I was like, if you didn't fire me, then I was going to have a conversation with you about representing you. So I don't know if that answers your question. I represent people, I choose who I represent. So I don't end up representing people who I think are aggressors or who are violent or who are committing crimes. But I do end up having clients who, make choices that I certainly would not make. And I do think it's something that is difficult as any client work, where you're working as a lawyer, you're working directly with clients. It can be a very challenging task for sure.
I did have one quick question, Lindsey, if you don't mind me asking. When you were bringing up issues around whether it be nude photos, you mentioned about victim blaming, about shaming. I've dealt with a few students I've actually taught that have been in this scenario of engaging with something where there were either nude photos or being blamed. Has this shifted or evolved, or do you have any kind of commentary on the way our society looks at people's sexuality or expression or blaming victims, or, you know, like you mentioned, like somebody takes a picture in the privacy of a relationship and then somehow there's a threat that they expose them and then the blame's on them or something like that. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that or any ways our society can move forward in dealing with that. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think that's such a good point. And I mean, I will say we had a huge, we had a conference. Actually, we're having another conference I can send you guys the information. It's gonna be a virtual conference, mostly for attorneys, but I think people are welcome to come, on a lot of these issues in October, which is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So everybody likes to have events in October, at least in New York, but I think it's actually elsewhere too, but Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And one of our panels was actually on youth and on an organization that I'm obsessed with called Safe Bay. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with them, but they're actually a youth-run, youth-led organization. And they talk a lot about these issues, about slut shaming, about sex shaming. You know, people have sex, people have, like, they send photographs, they have relationships where that's part of it. I mean, again, like, I'm not going to pretend like any of you guys like aren't doing things like that, or you don't know people that are doing things like that. Like, that's totally normal. Doing it in a way that's safe, I think, and kind of can protect yourself. One thing, and I won't pretend to be an expert on youth because I work almost exclusively with adult clients, but I do give a lot of trainings to people. I have a lot of colleagues who work directly with people under the age of 18 and 21. Most of my clients, have children who end up, are being under that age, but I don't have to work with them directly. But doing things like sexting, right? Sexting without photos is a big one. There's a whole panoply of like emojis and ways that you can like express yourself in ways without having pictures of yourself, or people do things like they can send pictures of themselves without sending identifying features, right? Or identifying that they are in the photo, like not having their heads or their faces or any identifying like parts of them, can be a little bit safer as well. And I think just being aware of who you're sending it to. I am never going to tell anybody, like, if they sent a picture, I don't care if they blasted it out to like, a bunch of people, that is okay if those people go online and then send it to all their family and friends, or send it to their teachers. I think what happens often that's very difficult is that people will, may share something online consensually, and then because if they have other things that is not like, let's say I had a client who posted some pictures on Tumblr of her and her then ex, sexual photos of them, and those were pictures they had both agreed they were comfortable with putting it online. Then her ex went and took all their pictures and dumped it all online, and there was a lot of pushback from the police and law enforcement and the court system of, well, you put one picture online, so that just means that, like, every picture that anybody ever takes of you having sex or engaging in sexual activity then goes online. I think, again, we're able to find subtlety in other areas, right? Like, we can understand the bank example, we can understand the test example. Why can't we understand the photo example, right? Just because I take my ATM card and I go to get money out, and now that ATM knows my debit, right? Like, I'm giving that ATM access to my card, or I run my card at a store. If that store then takes my card and like the store clerk purchases a bunch of food on there, that's not allowed. Like, just because we're sharing it in individual ways doesn't mean that I'm then just opening it up to the whole world. And I think it comes deeply from a place of misogyny and sexism and victim blaming, and this assumption that people shouldn't be sending these photos, or that it's bad, or it's gross, or it's nasty, or I don't know what, while people are still pretending like they didn't do that when they were younger, or that they don't have kids or people in their lives that are doing that. So I think education is key, and empowerment, and really, I do tons of trainings to judges and law enforcement, and really a lot of court staff to try to teach them about this. And actually, before we got the laws passed, we did a ton of work to submit memorandums and briefing, and I argued it all the time. I was like, Judge, like, you need to order this person not to post naked photos of my client. And it took years. It took like several years of me arguing that, but then now it happens all the time, and we get it in orders all the time because we asked for it, we explained the need for it, and we eventually have changed a little tiny piece of the culture here in New York City. And so I think you guys taking this back to your communities, to your families, to wherever you are, and being aware of this message, and really like having conversations. Like, I got in a fight with my Uber driver one time in South Carolina because he made a comment about pictures and stuff, and I was like, actually, that's very victim blaming. And I don't think it changed his mind, but you know, maybe it did. So I think culture shift is a hugely difficult thing, but the more that we talk about it, the more that we have things like the Me Too movement and people discussing what's happened to them, that's the only way that I see forward in order to change like hearts and minds going forward.
Thank you so much, Lindsey. And just one more question, I promise. I feel like I've said that for the past 3 questions. This time it's true.
I don't mind.
Is there a statute of limitations for the New York City laws and for the New York State laws currently?
That is such a good question. And I don't have it on top of my head. I think it's 2 years. It's the general statute of limitations. There's no special statute of limitations for the criminal part of the law. Now, the civil part, which I don't do, and I didn't get into so much, I talked about it briefly, the state law. All the laws have both criminal and civil components, right? The criminal component is going to jail, right? Like you get arrested, you go to jail. Civil component is you can sue someone in a civil court to get money damages. That's what civil cases are mostly. And then family court's like over here in its own little weird bucket because you don't get really money from family court, but you can get injunctive relief, which is like, I want you to stop doing something. That's what an injunctive relief is. So for the civil piece of these laws, there are longer statutes of limitations under the state law, I believe. That was, I don't know the years off the top of my head, but essentially it's from the date that you discovered the photographs or the content or reasonably should have discovered it. So let's say my client who had 10 years old, videos, and let's say that abuser had put it online, 8 years ago or 7 years ago. If it was placed in a location where she should have reasonably, known to discover it, then that might have passed the statute of limitations. But what if he only had it on his computer? Or what if he only sent it to one friend? That's where it becomes like a fact-based issue. I know that was like a very legally like in the weeds answer, but the answer is for the criminal piece, it's pretty straightforward. For the civil piece, it's a little more complicated.
Thank you so much, Lindsey. This has been such an education, and I think exactly what you said in answering Briar's question of it being an issue of education, and for a lot of the young folks on this call to share what they learned and to share what was discussed with their own communities, and to have a conversation about it, especially going into October. I mean, this was really perfect timing in terms of the theme. This, consider this, the beginning of our conversations leading into this month, and certainly not the end. Lindsey, seriously, I cannot thank you enough for your time. Thank you so much. And have a good night to you, and have a good night to everyone who's on the call.
Yeah, and I just want to say I popped my email address in the chat, and truly, I love talking with students. I work with a lot of students, and so many people answered my questions when I was in high school and college and law school. So please, if you have any questions about any of this, or just like about law school, or just like, I don't know, anything that came up on the call, please feel free to drop me a line. I'd be happy to talk with you.
Thank you, Lindsey. All right, everyone, thank you so much for engaging us. And for your friends who were not able to make it, we will share the discussion so that they can see and learn later. Thank you so much, and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you so much.